So long as we experience this state of imaginary self-forgetfulness, we do not experience ourselves as we really are. That is, as infinite and absolute being, infinite and absolute consciousness, and infinite and absolute happiness. Instead, we experience ourselves as a finite and relative being, a person who seems to exist now, but apparently did not exist before his or her birth, and apparently will not exist after his or her death. A person who sometimes rises as this finite and relative consciousness that we call our mind, and sometimes subsides in the state of relative unconsciousness that we call sleep. A person who experiences only finite and relative happiness, mixed with equally finite and relative unhappiness. In the state of relative unconsciousness that we call sleep, we do not experience ourself as a person, but simply as our own happy self-conscious being. Though in sleep we do not actually experience any form of relativity or finitude, from the perspective of our present waking mind, we have to say that sleep is only a relative and therefore finite state, because it is a state which we seem to enter and from which we seem to rise repeatedly. Therefore, though sleep is not finite in itself, relative to our other two states, waking and dream, it does appear to be finite. Since sleep is a state in which our mind has subsided, it transcends our mind, and hence it cannot be defined categorically as being either finite or infinite, or as being either relative or absolute. From the perspective of our mind, sleep is a finite and relative state, but from the perspective of our true, non-dual self-consciousness, I am, it is our real and natural state of infinite and absolute being, infinite and absolute consciousness, and infinite and absolute happiness. What we actually experience in sleep is only our non-dual consciousness of our own essential being, I am. So as such, sleep is a state devoid of any form of relativity or finitude. What makes sleep appear to be a relative and therefore finite state is the rising of our mind in the two truly relative and finite states of waking and dream. As Sri Sadhu Om used to say, if we raise two walls in a vast open space, that one open space will appear to be divided into three confined spaces. Similarly, when our mind imagines the existence of two different types of body, the body that it imagines to be itself in its current state, which it considers to be waking, and the body that it imagined to be itself in another state that it now considers to be dream, the infinite space of our true and absolute self-conscious being appears to be divided into three separate and therefore finite states, which we call waking, dream, and sleep. In reality, the state we now call sleep is our true, natural, infinite, and absolute state of unadulterated self-consciousness. However, so long as we feel ourselves to be this relative and finite consciousness that we call our mind, we cannot know sleep as it really is. That is, since we do not experience our essential self-consciousness I am, and its true unadulterated form in our present waking state, from the perspective of this waking state, we cannot recognize the fact that we did experience our self-consciousness I am in its true, unadulterated form in sleep. Therefore, in order to discover what we really experienced in sleep, we must experience our fundamental self-consciousness I am in its true, unadulterated form in our present waking state. In the perspective of our real self, which is the non-dual consciousness that knows nothing other than itself, the state that we call sleep is a state of infinite, absolute, and unadulterated self-consciousness. However, in the perspective of our real self, our other two states, which we call waking and dream, are equally states of infinite, absolute, and unadulterated self-consciousness. That is, in the infinite perspective of our real self, there is only one state, and that state is our single, non-dual, true, and natural state of absolute consciousness of our own essential being, I am. However, in the limited and distorted perspective of our mind, our one true state of non-dual self-consciousness appears to be three distinct states, which we call waking, dream, and sleep. Since in the perspective of our waking and dreaming mind, sleep appears to be a separate state, which exists relative to waking and dream, it seems to us now to be a limited state of relative unconsciousness, a state that results from a temporary forgetfulness of our waking and dreaming self, which is the object-knowing consciousness that we call our mind. Most forms of philosophy and science are concerned only, or at least principally, with what we experience in our present waking state. Even when they study our other two states, dream and sleep, they do so only from the perspective of our waking mind. Therefore, since all such forms of philosophy and science are centered around the experience of our waking mind, they tend to consider our experience in our other two states as being of only secondary importance. However, in our search for the absolute reality, dream and sleep are both crucially important states of consciousness, since they each give us essential clues concerning the true nature of our real self. Dream is important to us because it clearly demonstrates the fact that our mind has a wonderful power of imagination by which it is not only able to create a body and a whole world, but is also able to delude itself into mistaking its own imaginary creation to be real. Sleep is important to us because it clearly demonstrates the fact that we can exist and be conscious of our own existence even in the absence of our mind. In our search for the absolute reality, which transcends all the limitations created by our mind, sleep is in fact the most important of our three states of consciousness, because it is the only state in which we experience our fundamental knowledge, our essential self-consciousness I am, devoid of any other knowledge. Not only does sleep provide us with incontrovertible evidence of the fact that our essential nature is only our non-dual self-consciousness, our unadulterated consciousness of our own being I am, but it also provides us with the vital clue that we require in order to practice self-investigation effectively. That is, self-investigation or self-scrutiny, which is the practical research that we must perform in order to experience true self-knowledge, is a state of non-dual self-consciousness, a state in which we knowingly abide as nothing other than our own essential self-conscious being. If we did not already have a taste of this non-dual self-consciousness in sleep, it would be difficult for a mind which is always accustomed to experiencing only duality or otherness through its two states of activity, waking and dream, to comprehend what this state of non-dual self-consciousness actually is. And hence, when we attempt to practice self-investigation, which Sri Ramana revealed to us is the only means by which we can experience true self-knowledge, it would not be so easy for us to abide knowingly as our own essential self-conscious being, I am. Sri Ramana sometimes described sleep as a sample of our true state of non-dual self-consciousness, and at other times he described it as an imaginary state of self-forgetfulness. Why did he refer to sleep in these two different ways, which are seemingly contradictory? Sleep appears to be a state of self-forgetfulness only from the perspective of our mind, which is itself an imaginary product of our seeming self-forgetfulness. If we had not seemingly forgotten our real self, we could not now imagine ourselves to be this mind, which appears to be something other than our real self, our true non-dual consciousness of our own essential being or emness. Therefore, though our self-forgetfulness is truly imaginary, from the perspective of our mind, it is a fact that is undeniably real. Our imaginary self-forgetfulness is like a sleep, just as sleep is the seeming darkness or lack of clarity without which no dream could appear. So our self-forgetfulness is the seeming darkness or lack of clarity without which we could not imagine ourselves to be experiencing the states of dualistic knowledge that we call waking and dream. Though our mind disappears in sleep every day, it reappears from sleep as soon as it has thereby recuperated sufficient energy to engage in another period of activity. It appears, therefore, that in sleep, our mind somehow continues to exist in a seed form, a dormant and unmanifest form, which will again become manifest as soon as the conditions become favorable, the favorable conditions in this case being a sufficient internal store of energy to become active once again. Since our mind reappears after a period of rest and sleep, from the perspective of this mind, our idea that in sleep we continue to be unaware or forgetful of our real self, our true non-dual consciousness of our own essential being, I am, appears to be quite true. Therefore, when talking from the perspective of our mind, Sri Ramana used to describe sleep as an imaginary state of self-forgetfulness. However, when we analyze our experience in sleep more deeply, as we have done in this chapter, it becomes clear to us that though we now imagine that we did not experience any consciousness in sleep, we did in fact experience our fundamental consciousness of our own essential being I am. Therefore, though sleep does appear to our waking mind to be a state of self-forgetfulness, on more careful consideration we cannot deny the fact that we did indeed experience our natural and eternal self-consciousness even in sleep. Hence, when talking from the perspective of the absolute reality, which is our own infinite self-consciousness, I am, Sri Ramana used to describe sleep as our true state of non-dual self-consciousness. This is true. The truth is that we do indeed know that we are even in sleep. However, though in sleep we know that we are, we appear not to know what we are. Nevertheless, though we appear not to know what we are in sleep, we should remember that this is seeming ignorance or forgetfulness of our real self in sleep is imaginary and therefore unreal, just as our present ignorance or forgetfulness of our real self is imaginary and unreal. We have never truly forgotten our real self or been ignorant of it. We merely imagine that we do not know ourselves as we really are. However, Sri Ramana repeatedly pointed out to us, this imaginary self-ignorance or self-forgetfulness is experienced only by our mind and not by our real self, which always experiences itself as infinite and eternal happy consciousness of just being. Since in sleep we do not experience our mind, which alone imagines the existence of self-forgetfulness, sleep cannot really be a state of self-forgetfulness. Indeed, in sleep no individual consciousness exists to experience self-forgetfulness. All that exists in sleep is our unadulterated consciousness of our own real self or essential being I am. Therefore, though the relative truth about sleep is that it is a state of self-forgetfulness, the absolute truth about sleep is that it is a state of perfect self-consciousness or self-knowledge. However, though the absolute truth is that sleep is a state of infinite, non-dual self-consciousness, which is the only existing reality, so long as we imagine ourselves to be this mind for all practical purposes, we have to concede that sleep does indeed appear to be a relative state of self-forgetfulness. Only if we recognize the fact that the sole cause of the appearance of our mind is our imaginary self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance will we be able to understand that the only means by which we can transcend the limitations that are seemingly imposed upon us by our mind is to destroy this illusion of self-forgetfulness. In order to destroy this illusion, we must know ourselves as we really are. And in order to know ourselves as we really are, we must attend to ourselves, to our fundamental consciousness of our own essential being, I am. Therefore, though Sri Ramana experienced the absolute truth, the truth that we have never really forgotten ourselves, because we are the perfectly non-dual self-consciousness which never knows anything other than itself, in his teachings, he accepted the relative reality of our present imaginary self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance. This is the reason why he began the above verse of Ekatma Panchakam with the words, having forgotten ourself. After saying, having forgotten ourself, Sri Ramana says, having thought, this body indeed is myself, because our present imagination that we are this body arises as a result of our self-forgetfulness. If we clearly knew what we really are, we could not imagine ourselves to be anything that we are not. Therefore, we could not imagine ourselves to be this body if we did not first imagine our seeming self-forgetfulness or lack of clarity of self-consciousness. Whenever our mind becomes active, whether in waking or in dream, it first imagines itself to be a body. Then through the 5 senses of that imaginary body, it perceives an imaginary world. Our mind cannot function without first limiting itself within the confines of an imaginary body, which it mistakes to be I. Hence, our mind is an intrinsically limited and therefore distorted form of consciousness. Without imagining itself to be something finite, our mind could not imagine anything that is other than itself. All otherness or duality is an imagination that can come into existence only when we imagine ourselves to be a separate and therefore finite consciousness. Though we are in reality the infinite consciousness of just being, the essential non-dual self-consciousness I am, we imagine ourselves to be this finite, object-knowing consciousness that we call our mind. All that we know as other than ourself, all our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are merely products of our own imagination, and they appear to exist only because we imagine ourselves to be something separate from them. In sleep we experience our non-dual self-consciousness I am, but we do not experience any otherness, separation, or duality. Even in waking and dream we experience this same non-dual self-consciousness I am, but along with it we also experience the illusion of otherness, separation, or duality. Nothing that we experience is actually other than our own essential consciousness. Our consciousness is the fundamental substance that appears as all other things. Other things are all products of our imagination. What we call our imagination is a power or faculty that our consciousness possesses to modify itself seemingly into the form of our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. When we imagine our experience of thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, we create a seeming separation between ourself and these objects of our consciousness. Therefore, if we did not first imagine ourselves to be something separate, something limited or finite, we could not experience anything as being other than ourself. Hence, in order to imagine the existence of things other than ourself, we must begin by imagining ourselves to be one among the many finite things that we thus imagine. Thus, in order to experience a world, whether this world that we perceive in our present waking state or the world that we perceive in any of our other dreams, we must simultaneously imagine ourselves to be a particular body in that world, We can clearly recognize this fact when we consider our experience in dream. We do not experience a dream in the same manner that we experience a cinema show. When we watch a cinema show or television program, we experience ourselves as a spectator who exists outside the moving picture that we are watching. But when we experience a dream, we experience ourselves as a person, a body and mind, who is part of that dream world that we are experiencing. Similarly, when we experience our present waking state, we experience ourselves as a person, a body and mind, who is a part of this waking world that we are now experiencing. The consciousness that experiences both waking and dream is our mind, and our mind always experiences itself as being a particular body, which is a part of the world that it is currently experiencing. If we did not limit ourselves as a body and as a body-bound mind, we could not experience anything as being other than ourself, because in reality, we are the unlimited consciousness in which this entire dream of duality appears. Since we are the infinite consciousness in which all things appear and disappear, we alone really exist, and nothing that appears to exist can really be other than ourself. Therefore, our real consciousness can never know anything other than itself, our own real self or essential being I am. All otherness is experienced only by our mind, which is a limited and distorted form of our real consciousness. A dream actually appears within our own mind, but our mind experiences itself as being a body that exists within that dream. Such is the self-delusive power of our imagination. Therefore, in verse 3 of Ekatmat Panchakam, Sri Ramana says, when our body exists within ourself, who are the basic consciousness in which all things appear, a person who thinks himself or herself to be existing within that inconscient material body is like someone who thinks that the screen, which is the adhara, the underlying support or base, of a cinema picture exists within that picture. In the Kalivenba version of Ekatmat Panchakam, Sri Ramana added the compound word Sachidananda, which means being consciousness bliss, before the initial word of this verse, Tanul or within ourself, thereby reminding us that what we are in essence is only the perfectly peaceful consciousness of being I am. Other than our basic consciousness of our own being, everything that we know appears within the distorted, object-knowing form of our consciousness that we call our mind, which arises within us during waking and dream and subsides back into ourself during sleep. Our true consciousness of being, our essential self-consciousness I am, is therefore like the screen on which a cinema picture is projected because it is the one fundamental adhara or underlying base that supports the appearance and disappearance of our mind and everything that is known by it. Just as a dream appears within our own mind, so everything that we experience in this waking state appears within our own mind. However, though the world that we now perceive is experienced by us within our own mind, we imagine ourselves to be a particular body which is one among the many objects that exist in this world. Therefore, if we wish to know the truth about ourselves and this world, should we not determine which of these two conflicting experiences is real and which is an illusion? Does this world really exist only in our own mind? Or is our mind really something that exists only within a particular body in this world? Is this entire universe, which seems to be so vast, extending with no known limit in time or space, merely a series of thoughts in our mind? Or are we merely an insignificant person who lives for a few brief years in a small corner of this universe? In other words, is this whole world really in us, or are we really in it? if this body and world actually exist only in our own mind, as the body and world that we experience in a dream do, our experience that we are confined within the limits of this body cannot be real, and must therefore be an illusion. We could know that it is real, and not an illusion, only if we could prove to ourselves that this body and world really do exist outside of and independent of our own mind. Can we ever prove to ourselves that anything that we know exists independent of our own mind? No, except our own essential self-consciousness I am, which we experience in sleep in the absence of our mind. We cannot prove to ourselves that anything is more than a mere imagination that is created and experienced only in and by our own mind. All we know of our body and this world is only the thoughts or mental images of them which we have formed in our mind by our power of imagination. Except our fundamental consciousness of our own being I am, everything that we know can be known by us only within our own mind. Our belief that our body and this world really exist outside our mind is just wishful thinking. It is a blind belief, because it is not based upon any adequate evidence, and is therefore without any real foundation. When we know in this waking state that the world we perceived and the body we mistook to be ourself in a dream were in fact just figments of our imagination, and therefore existed only in our own mind, what reasonable grounds do we have for believing that our present body and the world that we now perceive are anything more than mere figments of our imagination? In the 18th paragraph of Nan-yar, Sri Ramana says, "Except that waking is dirgha, long-lasting, and dream is kashnika, momentary or lasting for only a short while, there is no other difference between these two imaginary states of mental activity. To the extent to which all the vyavaharas, doings, activities, affairs, or occurrences that happen in waking appear at this present moment to be real, to that same extent, even the vyavaharas that happen in dream appear at that time to be real. In dream, our mind takes another body to be itself. In both waking and dream, thoughts and names and forms, the objects of the seemingly external world, occur in one time, that is, simultaneously. Though in the first sentence of this paragraph, Sri Ramana says that the only difference between waking and dream is that in their relative duration, waking is long and dream is short. In verse 560 of Guru Vachaka Kove, he points out that even this difference is merely an illusion. The answer which stated that dream appears and disappears momentarily, whereas waking endures for a long time, was given as a consoling reply to the question asked. That is, it was a concession made in accordance with the then level of understanding of the questioner. In truth, however, time is merely a product of our mind's imagination, and hence the illusion that waking endures for a long time, whereas dream is momentary, is a deceptive trick that occurs due to the adherence of mind maya, our power of maya or self-delusion, which manifests in the form of our own mind. Since time is a figment of our imagination, we cannot measure the duration of one state by the standard of the time that we experience in another state. We may experience a dream which appears to last a long time, but when we wake up, we may find that, according to the time experienced in this waking state, we have slept for only a few minutes. Though it may now appear to us that our present waking state endures for many hours each day and resumes every day for many years, and that in contrast each of our dreams lasts for only a short period of time, this seeming distinction appears to be real only in the perspective of our mind in this waking state. In dream, our same mind experiences that dream as if it were a waking state, and imagines that it is a state that endures for many hours each day and resumes every day for many years. Time is an imagination that we do not experience in sleep, but is a part of each of the worlds that we experience in waking and dream. Since the world that we experienced in a dream is not the same world that we experience now in this present waking state, the time that we experienced as part of that dream world is not the same time that we are experiencing now. Therefore, if we try to judge the duration of dream by the standard of time that we experience now, our judgment will inevitably be distorted and therefore invalid. The relative reality of all that we experience in waking and dream cannot be correctly judged from either of these two states. When we are dreaming, we mistake everything that we experience in that dream to be real. But when we are in our present waking state, we understand that everything that we experienced in that dream is actually a figment of our imagination. Just as we can correctly judge the reality of all that we experienced in dream only when we step outside that dream into our present waking state, so we will be able to judge correctly the reality of all that we experience now in this so-called waking state only when we step outside it into some other state that transcends it. From the perspective of the all-transcending state of true self-knowledge, which is the state of non-dual and therefore absolute self-consciousness, Sri Ramana and other sages have been able to judge correctly the relative reality of all that we experience in waking and dream, and they have testified the fact that these two states are equally unreal, because they are both mere figments of our imagination. In the second sentence of the 18th paragraph of Nanyar, Sri Ramana says, "To the extent to which all the occurrences that happen in waking appear to be real, to that extent even the occurrences that happen in dream appear at that time to be real." This is a fact that we all know from our own experience, but what inference should we draw from it? Since we now know that whatever we experienced in a dream was just our own thoughts, even though at that time it appeared to be as real as whatever we experience in this waking state now appears to be, is it not reasonable for us to infer that whatever we experience in this waking state is most probably, likewise, just our own thoughts? Though this is a logical inference for us to draw, we can verify it for certain only when we ascertain the truth about ourself. Unless we know by our own experience what we really are, we cannot be sure of the reality of anything else that we know. In order to know ourself, we must keenly scrutinize ourself. That is, we must focus our attention wholly and exclusively upon our essential consciousness of our own being I am. So long as we have any desire, attachment, fear, or aversion for anything other than our own essential self-consciousness, whenever we try to focus our attention upon ourself, we will be distracted by our thoughts of whatever other things we desire, fear, or feel averse to. And so long as we believe that those other things exist outside our own imagination and are therefore real in their own right, we will not be able to free ourselves from our desire, attachment, fear, or aversion for them. Therefore, to help us to free ourselves from all our desires, attachments, fears, and aversions, Sri Ramana and other sages teach us the truth that everything other than our own self-consciousness I am is unreal, being a mere figment of our own imagination. This is why in verse 559 of Guru Vachaka Kovai, he confirmed the inference that we can draw from the fact that whatever we experienced in a dream appeared then to be as real as what we experience in this waking state appears now to be, stating explicitly, if dream, which appeared and was experienced by us as if it were real, is a mere whirling of our own thoughts, waking, which has now occurred and is being experienced by us as if it were real, is also of that same nature. That is, it is likewise a mere whirling of our own thoughts. As real as the happenings in waking, which have now occurred, appear to be at this present moment, So real indeed the happenings in dream appeared to be at that time. Sri Ramana affirms emphatically that waking and dream are both a mere whirling of thoughts. That is, they are each a series of mental images that we form in our own mind by our power of imagination. In other words, except our fundamental self-consciousness I am, everything that we experience in either waking or dream is just a figment of our own imagination. The state that we now experience as waking is, in fact, just another dream. Just as we now mistake our present state to be waking in a dream, we likewise mistake our then current state to be waking. We always mistake whatever state we are currently experiencing to be our waking state, and we consider all our other states to be dreams. What distinguishes one state of dream from another is that in each such state or each series of such states, we mistake a different body to be ourself. Since we remember a series of consecutive states in which we mistook ourselves to be the same body that we now mistake ourselves to be, we consider each of those states to be a resumption of this same waking state. However, we also remember other states in which we mistook ourselves to be various other bodies, so we consider those other states to be dreams. Since the fact that we take various different bodies to be ourself is what makes us imagine that there is a basic distinction between our present so-called waking state and our other states of dream, in the third sentence of the 18th paragraph of Nanyar. Sri Ramana says, in dream, our mind takes another body. In our present state of dream, we consider certain other states of dream to be real, because in them we took this same body to be ourself. But we consider yet other states of dream to be unreal, because in them we mistook other bodies to be ourself. How exactly do we take another body in each of our dreams? In a dream we imagine the existence of some other body, and we simultaneously imagine that body to be ourself. Similarly, in our present so-called waking state, we imagine the existence of this body and simultaneously imagine it to be ourself. Just as the body that we mistook to be ourself in a dream was merely a product of our own imagination, so this body that we now mistake to be ourself is merely a product of our own imagination. The relationship between ourself and our body is similar to the relationship between gold and a gold ornament. Just as gold is the one substance of which the ornament is made, so we are the one substance of which our body and all the other objects of this world are made. Therefore, in verse 4 of Ekatma Panchakam, Sri Ramana says, in an ornament other than the gold of which it is made, having separated, freed, or disentangled ourself, what or how is our body? One who thinks himself or herself to be merely a finite body is an ajnani, a person who is ignorant of our real, infinite, and non-dual self, whereas one who takes himself or herself to be nothing other than our one real self is a jnani, a sage, who has known this one real self. Know yourself thus as this one infinite self. In the Kali Venba version of the Ekatma Panchakam, Sri Ramana added the word Vatuvam, which means the substance, before the initial word of this verse, pon, or gold. The word Vatu is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word Vastu, which means substance, essence, or reality, and which is a word that is often used in philosophy to denote the absolute reality, our own self-conscious being, which is the one essential substance of which all things are formed. Since Sri Ramana is here using gold as an analogy for our real self, by describing gold as the vastu, or substance, he implies that we ourselves are the one real substance of which our body and all other things are merely imaginary forms. The rhetorical question, having separated ourself, what is our body, expresses two closely related truths. First, it expresses the truth that our present body does not exist when we separate ourselves from it, as we do in both sleep and dream. Secondly, in this context, more importantly, this question is an idiomatic way of expressing the truth that just as an ornament cannot be other than the gold of which it is made, so our body cannot be other than our real self, which is the one substance of which all things are made. That is, we are consciousness, and everything that we know is merely a form or image that appears in our consciousness, that is, in us, like waves that appear on the surface of the ocean. Just as the water of the ocean is one substance of which all waves are formed, so our consciousness is the one substance of which all our thoughts, that is, all the objects known by us, including our body, are formed. Our body and everything else that we know are just a series of thoughts or mental images, which we form in our own mind by our power of imagination. Since everything other than our own consciousness is just a figment of our imagination, our consciousness alone is real, and hence it is the one true substance of which all other things are formed. In the final sentence of the 18th paragraph of Nan-Yar, Sri Ramana says, in both waking and dream, thoughts and names and forms occur simultaneously. In this context, the plural form of the compound word namarupa, which literally means name forms, and which I have translated as names and forms, denotes all the objects of the world, which we imagine exist outside ourselves. In each of our states of mental activity, whether we imagine that state to be waking or dream, we experience the fact that the objects that we recognize as being merely thoughts that we have formed in our own mind and the objects that seem to exist outside ourselves both appear simultaneously. Therefore, in verse 555 of Guru Vachaka Kovai, Sri Ramana says, sages say that those two seemingly different states that are called waking and dream are both creations of our confused, agitated, and deluded mind. And because in both states called waking and dream, thoughts and names and forms come into existence simultaneously and in conjunction, know for certain that this is so. As Sri Ramana often pointed out, all the objects of the seemingly external world are in fact experienced by us only as images that we form in our own mind by our power of imagination, and hence they are only our own thoughts. This is the reason why, in the absence of all thoughts as in sleep, no knowledge of any object is experienced, whereas as soon as our mind becomes active, as in waking and dream, our knowledge of external objects appears together with other thoughts. Even now, in our present waking state, if we turn our attention away from all thoughts towards our own essential self-consciousness, I am, all our knowledge of external objects will disappear. Is it not clear, therefore, that all our objective knowledge depends upon our thoughts about the objects that we know? We appear to know an object only when we form an image of it in our mind. Since mental images are what we otherwise call thoughts, all that we know of external objects is only the thoughts of them that we form in our own mind by our power of imagination. Except our essential self-consciousness I am, everything that we know or experience is only a thought, one among the many mental images that we form in our own mind. Just as we understand that everything that we experience in a dream is merely our own imagination, by impartial and thorough analysis, we can understand that everything that we experience in our present waking state is likewise merely our own imagination. Our belief that our knowledge of this seemingly external world corresponds to something that actually exists outside ourselves is merely an imagination, one among the many thoughts that we form in our mind. There is absolutely no evidence, and there never can be any evidence, that the world we now experience actually exists outside ourself, any more than there is any evidence that the world we experienced in a dream actually exists outside ourself. In verse 1 of Ekatma Panchakam, after the first two clauses, having forgotten ourself, and having thought this body indeed is myself, Sri Ramana adds a third clause, having thereby taken innumerable births. What exactly does he mean by this? How actually do we take innumerable births? As we have discussed earlier, our present waking life is actually just a dream that is occurring in our imaginary sleep of self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance. When we imaginarily ignore or forget our real self, which is infinite being, consciousness, and happiness, we seemingly separate ourself from the perfect happiness that is our own self. Therefore, until we reunite with our own reality, which is absolute happiness, we cannot rest, except during the brief but necessary interludes that we experience in sleep, death, and other such states, in which our mind subsides in a state of temporary obeisance or inactivity. Because we have imaginarily separated ourselves from our own infinite happiness, we feel perpetually dissatisfied, and hence our innate love for happiness impels us to search restlessly for the happiness that we have lost. Thus our natural love for happiness, which is our own true being, is seemingly distorted, manifesting in the form of desire, which impels us to be active, thereby driving ourselves further away from our true state of being. Whereas true love is our natural state of just being, desire gives rise to doing or activity, which distracts us from our essential being. How does our love for happiness become distorted as desire? Having imaginarily separated ourselves from our infinite real self, we now feel happiness to be something other than ourself, and therefore we seek it outside ourself in objects and experiences that we imagine to be other than ourself. In our natural state of true self-knowledge, we experience happiness as our own self, and hence our love for happiness impels us just to be ourself. In our imaginary state of self-ignorance, on the other hand, we experience happiness as if it were something other than ourself, and hence our simple love for happiness is distorted as innumerable desires for things other than ourself, for objects and experiences that we imagine will give us the happiness for which we crave. Because our self-ignorance clouds our natural clarity of discrimination, it deludes us, making us imagine that in order to be happy we must obtain things other than ourselves, whether material objects, sensual experiences, or intellectual knowledge. We imagine that certain experiences will make us happy, and certain other experiences will make us unhappy, and hence we desire those experiences that we imagine will make us happy, and we fear or feel averse to those experiences that we imagine will make us unhappy. Thus, our self-ignorance inevitably gives rise to our desires and fears, which impel us to be constantly active, striving by mind, speech, and body to experience the happiness for which we yearn so intensely. Until we attain the non-dual experience of true self-knowledge, thereby dissolving the illusion of self-ignorance and all its progeny, we will not be able to free ourselves from the gripping vice of desire and fear. Even when our mind subsides temporarily in a state of abeyance, such as sleep or death, our deeply rooted desires and fears are not dissolved, because our basic self-ignorance persists in a dormant form. Therefore, as soon as we are sufficiently rested, our dormant desires and fears rouse us from sleep, giving rise either to the experience of this waking state or to the experience of a dream. All our dreams are caused by our latent desires and fears, and our present waking state is just one of our dreams. Just as all that we experience in a dream is our own thoughts, which are formed by our latent desires and fears, So all that we experience in our present waking state is our own thoughts, which are likewise formed by our latent desires and fears. Since our present waking life is actually just a dream in our imaginary sleep of self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance, the state that we call death is merely the final termination of this particular dream. The entire life of our present body is one continuous dream, which is interrupted each day by a brief period of rest and sleep, but which resumes as soon as we have recuperated sufficient energy to engage in another period of mental activity. One feature of this dream is that the imaginary body that we now mistake to be ourself appears to grow gradually older and more worn out, until eventually we forsake it permanently. The state in which we thus permanently cease to imagine our present body to be ourself is what we generally call death. Since death is just the ending of an extended dream, it is merely a state of abeyance or temporary subsidence of our mind, like the sleep that we experience every day. After we have rested for a while in sleep, our latent desires and fears impel our mind to rise and become active once again in another state of dream. Similarly, after we have rested for a while in death, our latent desires and fears impel our mind to rise once again in another state of activity in which we imagine some other body to be ourself. Therefore, when Sri Ramana said, having taken innumerable births, he was referring to this repeated process of forsaking one dream body and imagining another dream body to be ourself. Rebirth or reincarnation is therefore not real, but is just a dream, an imaginary event that occurs repeatedly in our seemingly long sleep of imaginary self-ignorance. Though rebirth is merely a figment of our imagination, a dream created by our own desires and fears, it is as real as our present life in this world, which is itself just as real as our mind, the limited and distorted form of consciousness that experiences this and so many other dreams. Until we know what we really are, thereby putting an end to our imaginary sleep of self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance, we will continue to experience one dream after another. And in each of those dreams we will mistake ourselves to be a body that we have created by our own imagination. Since the fundamental cause of all the suffering and lack of perfect happiness that we experience in this dream life and so many other dream lives in our imaginary self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance, we can end all our suffering and attain perfect happiness only by experiencing the absolute clarity of true self-knowledge. Since the illusion of duality is caused by our self-forgetfulness, our forgetfulness of our fundamental non-dual consciousness of our own infinite and absolute being, it will be dissolved only when we experience perfectly clear non-dual self-knowledge or self-consciousness. By seemingly forgetting our real self, we enable ourselves to imagine that we have become a body. Therefore, though we have never really ceased to be our infinite real self, we do appear to have become something else. Hence, in this first verse of Ekatma Panchakam, Sri Ramana says that having forgotten our real self, having repeatedly imagined ourselves to be a body, and having thereby seemingly taken birth in innumerable different bodies, when we finally know ourselves, we become ourselves once again. Though he says, finally knowing ourself and thereby becoming ourself, he does not mean to imply that the attainment of true self-knowledge is really a process of becoming. Relative to our present state of self-forgetfulness, in which we seem to have become a body and mind, the state of self-knowledge may appear to be a state in which we will once again become our real self. But in reality it is just our natural state of being, in which we remain as we always have been, that is, as our immutable real self. The word that Sri Ramana actually uses in this verse is adal, which is the gerund that primarily means becoming, but can also mean being. Therefore, though the words irudi tane unardu tan adal, which form the subject of this verse, could be translated as finally knowing ourself and thereby becoming ourself, they can be translated more accurately as finally knowing ourself and thereby just being ourself. The state of true self-knowledge is our natural, eternal, immutable, and non-dual state of self-conscious being. Since it is the absolute reality which underlies the appearance of all relativity, it can never undergo any form of change or becoming. It never has become anything, and it never will become anything. It just is. When we imagine that we know anything other than ourself, we seem to become something limited. However, such becoming is only imaginary. In reality, we always remain as we really are. That is, as infinite and absolute being, consciousness, and happiness. Hence, when we know ourselves as we really are, we do not become anything, but simply remain as the infinite and absolute reality that we always have been and always will be. Therefore, in verse 26 of Upadesa Undiyar, Sri Ramana says, being our real self is indeed knowing our real self, because our real self is that which is devoid of two. Since we are the absolute reality, we are in truth devoid of any form of duality, and since we can know ourself only by being ourself, which is what we always are, therefore the state that we call self-knowledge is not a state in which we know anything new, but is only the state in which we shed all knowledge of everything other than ourself. When we wake up from a dream, we do not become anything new or know anything new. We merely shed the imaginary experience of our dream and remain as we previously were. Similarly, when we wake up from our imaginary sleep of self-forgetfulness, in which we have experienced innumerable dreams, we will not become anything new or know anything new. We will merely shed the imaginary experience of our self-forgetfulness and all our resulting dreams and remain as the infinite and absolutely non-dual self-consciousness that we always have been. Therefore, Sri Ramana concludes this first verse of Ekatma Panchakam by saying, finally knowing ourself and being ourself is just like waking from a dream of wandering about the world. When we wake up from a dream, we know that everything that we experienced in that dream was merely our own imagination and was therefore entirely unreal. Similarly, when we attain the non-dual experience of true self-knowledge, we will know that everything that we experienced in this state of self-forgetfulness, including our self-forgetfulness itself, is merely our own imagination and is therefore entirely unreal. In our present experience, the only thing that is real is our own self-consciousness I am. If we did not exist, we could not know our own existence, nor could we imagine the existence of anything else. The one real basis of all our knowledge and all our experience is our own consciousness. When we say I know or I experience, we imply I am conscious. However, though we sometimes appear to be conscious of things other than ourselves, our consciousness of those other things appears and disappears. Being impermanent, it is only relatively real. The only thing of which we are permanently conscious is ourself, our own being I am. Even when we are conscious of nothing else, as in sleep, we continue to be conscious of our own being, because our being is inherently self-conscious. In other words, we are self-consciousness, and hence we always experience ourselves as I am. Since our consciousness of other things appears only when our mind is active, it is merely an imagination. But since we are the consciousness that experiences both that imagination and the absence of it in sleep, we are the real consciousness that underlies the imaginary consciousness of otherness. Since the only form of consciousness that we experience permanently is our own self-consciousness, we can definitely conclude that it is the true and essential form of consciousness. In other words, since we are the fundamental self-consciousness that underlies the appearance of all other forms of consciousness, we alone are the true and essential form of consciousness. We can also conclude that we are the absolute reality, because we are the fundamental non-dual self-consciousness I am, which is essentially unqualified and unconditioned, being free from all limits and any form of dependence upon any other thing. Whatever else may appear or disappear, and whatever change or other action may seem to happen, our essential self-consciousness always remains unchanged and unaffected. Therefore, whereas all other things are relative, our true self-consciousness is absolute. We are absolute being, absolute consciousness, and absolute happiness. Therefore, if we wish to free ourselves from all unhappiness and all forms of limitation, we must know ourselves as we really are. That is, we must actually experience ourselves as the absolute non-dual self-consciousness that we really are, and that we now understand ourselves to be. In order to know ourselves thus, we must concentrate our entire attention upon our essential self-consciousness I am. This concentration of our attention upon ourselves is the practice of Atma Vichara, self-investigation, self-examination, self-scrutiny, or self-inquiry, which Sri Ramana taught is the only means by which we can experience true, non-dual self-knowledge. Before concluding this chapter, in which we have attempted to find a satisfactory theoretical answer to the crucial question, who am I, it is worth narrating an important event in the early life of Sri Ramana. The first person who asked him truly pertinent and useful questions was a humble and self-effacing devotee called Sri Sivaprakasham Pillai, who first came to him in 1901 when he was just 21 years old. The first question Sri Sivaprakasham Pillai asked him was, "Who am I?" To which he replied simply, "Knowledge, for consciousness alone is I." The actual Tamil words spoken by Sri Sivaprakasham Pillai were Nanyar, which literally means, I am who. And the words that Sri Ramana, who seldom spoke in those early times, wrote in reply with his finger on the sandy ground were, Arivi Nan. The Tamil word Arivu means knowledge in the broadest sense, and is therefore used to denote many different forms of knowledge, including consciousness, wisdom, intelligence, learning, sense perception, anything that is known, and even Atma, our real self, which is our fundamental knowledge I am. In this context, however, it means only our fundamental knowledge I am, our essential consciousness of our own being. The letter E that he appended to Arivu is a suffix that is commonly used in Tamil to add emphasis to a word, conveying the sense itself, alone, or indeed, and the word Nan means I. In these two simple words, Arive Nan, Sri Ramana summarized the essence of his experience of true self-knowledge, which is the basis of the entire philosophy and science that he taught. What he meant by these simple words is that our true and essential nature is only our fundamental knowledge or consciousness I am, which is the conclusion that we have arrived at if we critically analyze our experience of ourself in our three ordinary states of consciousness, as we have done in this chapter. The next question that Sri Sivaprakasham Pillai asked him was, what is the nature of such knowledge? To which he replied, either the nature of knowledge is Sachidananda, or more probably Sachidananda, The compound word Sachidananda, which is actually fused into one word, transliterated correctly as Sachidananda, is a well-known philosophical term which is of Sanskrit origin, but which is widely understood and frequently used in Tamil and all other Indian languages. It is a term used to describe the nature of the absolute reality, and though it is composed of 3 words, it is not intended to imply that the absolute reality is composed of 3 distinct elements, but only that the single non-dual nature of the one absolute reality can be described in 3 different ways. The word Sat basically means being or existing, but by extension also means that which really is, reality, truth, existence, essence, real, true, good, right, or that which is real, true, good, or right. The word Chit means consciousness or awareness, from a verbal root meaning to know, to be conscious of, to perceive, to observe, to attend to, or to be attentive. And the word Ananda means happiness, joy, or bliss. Thus, Sachidananda, or as it more commonly spelt in Roman script, Sachidananda, means being, consciousness, bliss. That is, being which is both consciousness and bliss, or consciousness which is both being and bliss, or bliss which is both being and consciousness. True being and true consciousness are not 2 different things. If consciousness were not the essential nature of being, being would have to depend upon some consciousness other than itself in order to be known, and hence it would not be absolute being, but only relative being, being that existed only in the view of some other existing consciousness. If we postulate that there is an absolute being that is not conscious of its own existence, and that exists even though it is not known either by itself or by any consciousness other than itself, such a being would be a mere supposition or imagination, a being that exists only in our own mind, and hence it would not be real being. We have no valid reason to suppose that any such unknown being exists. The term being or existence has a valid meaning only if it is applied to something that is known to exist, and not if it is applied to something whose existence is merely imaginary. Therefore, true and absolute being must always be conscious of its own being, and hence consciousness must be its very nature. Similarly, the very nature of consciousness must be being, because if being were not the essential nature of consciousness, consciousness would not be. It would not exist. A non-existent consciousness, a consciousness that is not, would have absolutely no reality. It would be nothing, and hence it would not be conscious. To be conscious means to be, just as to be truly means to be conscious. To know that I am. True and absolute being, being that exists unconditionally and independent of any other thing, must be self-conscious being, being that knows I am. Though it does not know any other thing because there is nothing other than it for it to know, it must always know itself. Therefore, the consciousness that knows its own being as I am is the only true, independent, unconditional, and absolute being. Any other being, any being that does not know itself as I am, is merely a figment of our imagination. Since in its essential nature, being or consciousness has no form, it is devoid of limits and includes everything within itself. Since a thing can be said to be a thing only if it is, nothing exists separate from or other than being. Everything that exists is therefore in its essential nature just being. Though a thing can be said to be only if it is known to be, most things do not actually know their own being. A thing that does not know that it is, and that is known only by some consciousness that is seemingly other than itself, does not exist independently or absolutely. Its seeming existence as a thing is only relative. Therefore it is not real as the thing that it appears to be, but is real only as the mere being that is its essence. The only thing that is real as such is consciousness, because only consciousness knows its own being. Therefore, since being is the essential nature of everything, and since being is always conscious of its own being, anything that does not know I am is a mere imagination, an illusion, an apparition that, though unreal as the thing that it appears to be, is nevertheless real in its essential nature as mere being. Though being has no form of its own, it is the indefinable essence of all forms. Being essentially formless, being is devoid of all forms of limitation, and hence it is infinite. Since the infinite includes all things within itself, it is essentially single and non-dual. There cannot be more than one infinite reality, because if there were, none of those infinite realities would actually be infinite. Being is therefore the non-dual infinite whole, the totality of all that is. However, though being is infinite and non-dual in itself, it nevertheless includes within itself all that is finite and dual. Though duality appears to exist in being, it is not the essential nature of being, but is a mere illusion. It is an illusory form of being, an imagination that appears and disappears in being, yet does not affect the essential, formless, infinite, and non-dual nature of being, even in the least. However, though it is an illusory imagination, duality could not even appear to exist without the underlying support of the essential, infinite, and non-dual being. Just as being is non-dual, so the consciousness of being is non-dual, because it knows only its own being and nothing else. The consciousness that appears to know things that it imagines to be other than itself is not the infinite absolute, and therefore real consciousness, but is only a finite, relative, and therefore unreal form of consciousness. Just as any finite, relative, or dual form of being is not the true and essential nature of being, so any finite, relative, or dual form of consciousness is not the true and essential nature of consciousness. Therefore, the compound word Sat-Chit denotes only the real and essential being consciousness, which is completely unconditional, independent, non-dual, infinite, and absolute. Just as the essential absolute and infinite reality is both being and the consciousness of being, so it is also perfect happiness or bliss. Unhappiness is not a natural condition, any more than either non-existence or unconsciousness is natural. Non-existence, unconsciousness, and unhappiness are not in any way absolute, but are merely relative conditions that appear to arise only when we mistake ourselves to be the finite form of a physical body. In sleep, when we do not mistake ourselves to be a body or any other finite thing, we exist happily knowing only our own being. Our being, our consciousness of being, and the happiness that we enjoy when we are conscious only of our being are therefore our essential nature. When everything else is taken away from us, what remains is only our essential nature, and that is our perfectly peaceful and happy consciousness of our own being, I am. Happiness is an unnatural and therefore unreal condition that appears to arise only when, by our power of imagination, we superimpose some other knowledge upon our fundamental and essential knowledge, I am. Therefore, as Sri Ramana stated in answer to the second question of Sri Sivaprakasam Pillai, the nature of our fundamental knowledge, I am, is Sachidananda, or being consciousness bliss. This does not mean that our true nature, which we always experience as I am, is any relative or finite form of being, consciousness, or happiness, but only that it is absolute, infinite, eternal, immutable, undivided, and non-dual being consciousness bliss, as Sri Ramana states explicitly in verse 28 of Upadesa Undiyar and verse 18 of Upadesa Danipakal. If we know what our real nature is, then we will discover it to be beginningless, endless, and unbroken, Sachidananda being consciousness bliss. If we know our real form in our heart, in the innermost core or depth of our being, we will discover it to be being consciousness bliss, which is fullness, infinite wholeness, completeness or perfection without beginning or end. Though these two verses express the actual truth experienced by Sri Ramana and all other sages, the idea that we ourselves are the infinite and absolute reality may appear to many of us to be fanciful and far-fetched, though by critically analyzing our experience of ourself in our three ordinary states of consciousness, as we did earlier in this chapter, we may have been convinced that in essence we are nothing other than our fundamental consciousness of being, I am. We may still find it hard to comprehend the fact that our fundamental consciousness or knowledge of I am, which is our real self, is in truth the infinite and absolute reality. Let us therefore examine this idea more closely in order to ascertain whether or not we have any reasonable grounds for believing it to be true. Because sages experience this truth as their own real nature, they do not need any philosophical analysis or theoretical arguments to convince them that it is true. But for those of us who mistake ourselves to be a finite individual, a clear understanding of the rationality of this idea is necessary to convince us that it is the truth, and that it is the one and only experience that is truly worthy for us to make effort to attain. Let us therefore see what reasonable grounds we may have, if any, to conclude that we are, in truth, the infinite and absolute reality. Assuming that we have all been convinced by our earlier analysis that our essential nature is only our basic self-consciousness, our fundamental consciousness of our own being, I am, let us take that conclusion as our starting point. Unlike our mind, our superficial knowing consciousness, which always mistakes itself to be a particular body, our real self, our fundamental being consciousness, does not mistake itself to be any particular thing, and hence it has no particular form or dimension. Therefore, whereas our mind has limited itself within the dimensions of time and space, by identifying itself with a finite body, our real consciousness of being is not limited in any way. In sleep, when we cease to mistake ourselves to be a finite body, we do not feel that we exist in any particular time or place, but feel only I am. The limits of time and space are ideas that arise only when we imagine ourselves to be a particular body in either waking or dream. Even now in this waking state, if we try for a moment to ignore our body and mind and to be conscious only of our own being I am, we will be able to recognize that our consciousness I am is not something that is limited within the bounds of our physical body. It just is, and is not something that can be located at any particular point in time or space. Even when we identify ourselves with the body and therefore feel ourselves to be located at a particular point in time and space, we always know I am. Our consciousness or knowledge I am is therefore unaffected by any changes in time and space. It exists unconditionally, and since it exists in all our three states of consciousness, it exists independent of any body, and therefore independent of time and space. Just as the time and space that we perceive in a dream are both ideas that exist only in our own mind, so the time and space that we perceive in our present waking state are likewise both ideas that exist only in our own mind. When our mind subsides, as in sleep, time and space both cease to exist, or at least they disappear and are no longer known by us. Therefore, since we have no reason to suppose that they exist in any way independent of or separate from the idea or mental image that we have of them, we can reasonably hypothesize that they are both mere thoughts, a fact that is confirmed by Sri Ramana and other sages. Since time and space, as we know them, arise only in our mind, and since our mind rises only in our fundamental being consciousness I am, is it not reasonable for us to infer that our being consciousness transcends both time and space? Just as it transcends time and space, it transcends every other imaginable dimension. Only that which has a particular definable form and which therefore occupies a distinct and definable extent in one or more dimensions can be said to be limited or finite. But since our fundamental and essential being consciousness I am has no definable form or content, it is not limited in any way and is therefore infinite. Since everything that we know arises in our mind, and since our mind arises in our being consciousness, all finite things are contained in our infinite being consciousness I am. So long as we do not imagine ourselves to be a body or any other object that seems to appear in our consciousness, we are infinite. Our being and our consciousness of being are both infinite, or to be more precise, they are both the one infinite and non-dual reality. Since our being is infinite, nothing can be separate from it, and hence it alone truly exists. However, when we imagine ourselves to be a body, innumerable other objects seem to arise in our consciousness, and we imagine that each of them truly exists. Thus, by our power of imagination, we give a seeming being or reality to many things, and thereby we delude ourselves into believing that each thing has its own independent and finite being. In reality, however, nothing has an independent or separate being. Being is not a finite thing that can be divided into parts, but is the one infinite and therefore indivisible whole, other than which nothing can be. Since it is infinite, it includes everything within itself, and hence it is the one essential being of each and every thing. No particular thing is real as the particular thing that it appears to be, as its particular form, or as the particular name, description, or definition that we give to its form, but is really only as the being that it essentially is. Other than being, nothing is. Since we always know ourselves as I am, our essential being is itself, our consciousness of our being. Our consciousness of our being, our knowledge I am, is the one fundamental basis of all our other knowledge. If we did not know I am, we could not know any other thing. Whatever we may know, we know it only because we first know our own being as I am. Therefore, our fundamental knowledge I am, our real and essential self-consciousness or being consciousness, is the true foundation that underlies and supports the seeming existence of all other things. Without depending upon the support of our being, nothing else could appear to be. All other things appear to be only because we are. We are, therefore, the one fundamental and absolute being, other than which nothing is. Since nothing is other than us, we are infinite and include all things within ourself, that is, within our own self-conscious being. We are therefore the one non-dual and infinite being, because the one non-dual and infinite being is our own essential self, which we always experience as I am. We refer to it as our own being. However, though we have no real being other than the one infinite reality, is it correct for us to consider it to be just our being? Since it is the only being that really is it not the essential being of all things, of everything that appears to exist? Yes, to the extent that things exist, they do all share in the one common being of the infinite reality. However, there is a fundamental difference between the being that we imagine we see in other things and the being that we experience in ourself. All the things that we know as other than ourself are only thoughts or mental images that exist in our own mind. and therefore they are known not by themselves but only by our mind. But whereas other things are not conscious of their own being, we are conscious of our own being. Therefore, though in other things we know only being, in ourself we know both being and consciousness. The consciousness that we imagine we see in other people and in other creatures is not actually experienced by us, but is only inferred by us, just as we infer that each person and creature that we see in a dream has consciousness. The only consciousness that we know directly and not by mere inference is our own consciousness. Since we know that our consciousness is, and since we do not exist apart from our consciousness is itself our being, and hence we experience it as I am. Just as the consciousness that we see in all other people and creatures is only inferred by us, so the being that we see in all other things is only inferred by us. The only being we know directly is our own being. The being or existence of all other things is known by us not directly, but only through the imperfect channel of our mind, our limited and distorted consciousness that feels, I am this body. The seemingly separate being or existence of other things deludes us and reinforces in our mind the illusion that being or reality is divided, mutable, and relative. The seemingly separate being of other things depends upon the seemingly separate being of our mind, because it is known only by our own mind, and not by our essential non-dual consciousness of being, which knows only itself, and no separateness or otherness. The seemingly separate being of our mind depends upon the real being of our essential consciousness I am, because without identifying that real consciousness as itself, our mind would not appear to know either its own being or the being of any other thing. However, since it appears and disappears, the separate being or existence of our mind is not real being, but is only a semblance of real being, a thing that appears to be at one time and ceases to be at some other time, is not real being, but is only a seeming form of being, a being which depends upon time and is therefore conditional. If a thing really is, it must be at all times and under all conditions. The only being that is at all times and under all conditions is our own essential being, which we always know as I am. Not only does it exist at all times and under all conditions, but it also exists immutably, without ever undergoing any change. In contrast, the being of all other things appears and disappears, and constantly undergoes change. Moreover, unlike all other things, our own essential being always knows itself, and does not depend upon any other thing to be known. Therefore, it is the only being that really is. Since the being of all other things is not real but is only an illusion or apparition, and since the only real being is our own essential being I am, real being is, in fact, never divided, even though it appears to be divided as many separate beings, as the separate being of each of the many different things that appear to be. Our own real and essential being is always single, non-dual, and indivisible, and since nothing exists apart from it, it is infinite and includes all things within itself.